There is a survival response that hardly anyone talks about. You have heard of fight, you have heard of flight, you have probably heard of freeze as well, and the paralysis that sets in when neither fighting nor running feels possible. But there is a fourth response. And in many ways, it is the most socially invisible, the most praised by the world around it, and the most quietly devastating for the person who is living inside it. It is called fawn. Fawning is what happens when a child learns that safety does not come from fighting, running, or going still. Safety in their environment comes from pleasing, from becoming exactly what the other person needs, from shrinking their own needs down to nothing, making themselves useful, agreeable, endlessly accommodating, and in exchange, purchasing just enough safety to survive. If you are someone who finds it almost impossible to say no, if you feel a quiet panic when someone is displeased with you, if you give and give until you are empty and then give more, if you do not know what you actually want because your attention has always been entirely occupied by what everyone else needs, then this video is for you. My name is Jonathan. Welcome back to my channel Alchemy of Remembrance. The term fawn as a trauma response was developed and named by psychotherapist Pete Walker, who drew on decades of working with complex PTSD. Walker noticed that alongside the classical fight, flight, and freeze responses, there was a distinct fourth pattern, one that looked on the outside like kindness, agreeableness, and social ease, but underneath it was something entirely different. Fawning is hypervigilance directed outward. It is the constant scanning of another person's emotional state, not out of genuine curiosity or care, but out of a deep survival imperative. The fawning child, and later the fawning adult, has learned to read the room the way an animal reads the weather, because getting it wrong had consequences, not always dramatic consequences. Often the consequences were subtle: a withdrawal of warmth, a look of disappointment, a silence that lasted too long. But for a child who is completely dependent on their caregiver, even the withdrawal of emotional warmth registers as a survival threat. The nervous system does not distinguish between the danger of a predator and the danger of a parent's disapproval. It simply reads, "not safe." And so the child adapts. They become extraordinarily good at managing the emotional weather around them. They learn what version of themselves generates warmth and what version generates withdrawal. They learn to suppress inconvenient emotions, anger especially, but also grief, desire, and need. They become, in the words that are often used to praise them, such a good child, so easy, so considerate, so mature for their age, and so on. What is actually happening is that a child is disappearing to survive. And the tragedy is that nobody, including the parents, recognizes this as a wound. It looks like a virtue. It gets rewarded, it gets praised, and so the adaptation deepens and deepens until it becomes not a strategy but an identity. The fawning child who grows up becomes the adult who cannot find themselves inside a relationship. They can describe their partner's needs with extraordinary precision. They can tell you exactly what their boss wants to hear, what their friends need from them, what their room requires. But ask them what they want, genuinely want, not what they think they should want, not what would be acceptable to want, and they often go quiet. There is a blankness there, a void where a self should be. This is not a weakness. I want to be very clear about that. People with strong fawn responses are often among the most emotionally intelligent, perceptive, and relationally gifted people I have ever encountered. Their capacity to attune to others is extraordinary. It was forged in conditions of genuine necessity, but there is a difference between attunement that flows from genuine care and attunement that flows from survival anxiety. And that difference, while invisible from the outside, is felt constantly from the inside. In practice, genuine care can rest, it can say no, it can allow another person to be uncomfortable without experiencing that discomfort as a personal emergency. It can be present without being consumed. But fawn driven attunement cannot do any of those things because it is not really about the other person at all. It is about managing the internal panic that arrives whenever someone appears dissatisfied. The other person's emotional state has become a regulator for the fawning person's own nervous system. Their approval is the drug, their disapproval is the withdrawal. And this is where the inner matrix does some of its most thorough work, because the fawning adult will unconsciously select relationships and environments that recreate the original dynamic, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the nervous system seeks what is familiar. What is familiar feels like home, even when home was a place that hurt you. Here is something that took me quite a long time to understand. When we talk about the fawn response, we are not just talking about behavior patterns, we are talking about something that happened, or rather, something that failed to happen during the formation of identity itself. There is a developmental process that psychologists sometimes call individuation. It is the process by which a child separates from the parent, not physically but psychologically. They begin to form their own preferences, their own opinions, their own boundaries. They test the world with their no. They experiment with wanting things that the parent does not want for them. This friction, handled well, is how a self forms, right? But in the environment that produces fawning, that friction was not safe. The child's no produced consequences severe enough that the no got buried. The child's anger, their desire, their authentic selfhood, these were incompatible with the safety they needed. And so they were sacrificed, not all at once, but gradually, incrementally, until the habit of self sacrifice became unconscious. What remains is what psychologists call a false self. Not a lie exactly, more like a costume that was worn for so long that it began to feel like skin. A version of the self built entirely around what generates approval rather than what is actually true. And the real self, the authentic one, with its inconvenient desires and its unacceptable anger and its genuine needs, that self did not die. It went underground, into the shadow, into the deep mind, where it continues to influence everything from a place where it cannot be seen. This is why the inner child work is not optional for people healing from fawn. The part of you that disappeared is not gone, it is waiting, and it needs to be found. I want to spend a moment on something that makes this pattern so difficult to heal, and that is the way fawning disguises itself as virtue. Fawning looks like generosity. Fawning looks like selflessness. Fawning looks like empathy, consideration, and emotional maturity. And in a culture that constantly rewards those who give more than they receive, who never complain, who make themselves endlessly available, fawning is not just tolerated, it is celebrated. Many people with a strong fawn response have built entire identities, entire careers, and their entire social reputations around being the generous one, the reliable one, the one who always shows up. And there is genuine beauty in those qualities when they come from a full cup, from authentic care, from real presence. But when they come from depletion, when the giving continues long after there is nothing left to give, because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing, that is not generosity. That is actually a wound wearing the costume of virtue. And the world will not save you from this. The world will keep taking what you offer. The people who benefit from your fawning will rarely volunteer the information that you are disappearing. Some of them, not all but some, have their own wounding that makes a fawning partner, friend, or colleague feel very comfortable. Your selflessness mirrors something they need to be confirmed about themselves. This is why the healing has to come from inside. Nobody else can give you permission to have needs. Nobody else can return you to yourself. It requires an act of radical self honesty that says, I have been living as a function of other people's comfort and I am allowed to stop. So, what does healing from Fawn actually look like? What does it require? First, and this is not small, it requires grieving. Grieving the self that did not get to form, grieving the needs that went unmet, grieving the relationships where you gave everything and received so little. This grief is real and it deserves to be felt rather than bypassed or suppressed. Second, it requires learning to tolerate what felt intolerable, the discomfort of disappointing someone. This does not mean becoming callous. It means understanding that another person's disappointment is their emotional experience, not your emergency. That you can care about their feelings without being responsible for managing them. This is perhaps the most practically difficult part of healing from Fawn, because the nervous system has been trained for years, sometimes decades, to experience another person's displeasure as a threat to survival. That training does not undo itself through understanding alone. It requires repetition. Small experiments in staying present when someone is unhappy with you, noticing that the feared catastrophe, the withdrawal, the abandonment, the punishment often does not come. And slowly, the nervous system learns that your presence does not require their approval. Third, and perhaps most importantly, and it requires beginning to ask repeatedly and sincerely, what do I actually want? Not what I should want. Not what would make this easier, but what do I genuinely, honestly want? This question will feel strange at first. The answer may not come easily. The authentic self has been underground for a long, long time, but it is there and it responds to being asked. The inner child that learned to disappear is also the inner child that carries your original joy, your original creativity, your original sense of what is worth living for. Finding it again is not indulgence, it is the beginning of your real sovereignty. The fawn response is one of the most common wounds in the people drawn to this kind of inner work, and also one of the least talked about, because from the outside it looks like everything is fine, but you know when it is not fine. You know the feeling of giving endlessly from a place of anxiety rather than abundance. You know the quiet loneliness of being deeply known by nobody, including yourself. That loneliness is a signal, not a life sentence, a signal that the self is waiting to be found. Next week, we go into topics that deepen the framework further, the invisible collective structures that feed on human emotional energy, the egregores, the thought forms that live in the space between minds and shape perception from the outside in. I am your friend Jonathan. This is Alchemy of Remembrance. Please subscribe to the channel if you are new here and want to walk this path towards self-remembrance. I will see you in the next video. Have a great day. Peace and love.